Good morning, Ma'am Ruth.
Good morning, Ma'am
Good
Ruth.
morning, Sir Sai. Good morning, Sir Ken. Alam niyo, napaka-privilege natin ngayong araw no, na makasama natin ang ating first speaker. Because our first speaker is a graduate from Ateneo Law School in 2016 with a Juris Doctor degree and practiced litigation, election, family, and corporate law. He is also a co-founder of an NGO or a non-government organization. Ito ang pangalan nun, Legal Advocates for Children's Welfare. Napakaganda talaga, no? So he is currently in the division of the Legal and Legislative Division of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Attorney Ralbert John Neil Tibayan. Good morning po, Attorney.
Good morning. Narinig niyo ako?
Yes. Yes po, Attorney. Good morning po and welcome po.
Hello, Ms. Ruth. Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to discuss yung tax incentives under the Republic Act number 8525 or the Adopt a School Act of 1998. So I will be focusing on the revenue regulations of the BIR. Sige, let's start, no? Slide 1. Okay, so RA 8525 entitled An Act Establishing an Adopt a School Program, providing incentives therefore and for other purposes, became law way back in Feb 14, 1998 or on Valentine's Day. Next slide po tayo. So essentially, no, the law was established to encourage private companies, no, to assist a public school, particularly those in poverty-stricken provinces of the country. Sa second po. Second. Isa taas po. One. Taas po isang slide. Yan. So, itong 20 poorest provinces, if I'm not mistaken, no, PSA na yan nagde-determine ito. So, next slide tayo. Basically, what happens here is that a memorandum of agreement is entered into by the adopting private entity and the head of the school. Then this is ratified by CHED, TESDA, or DepEd, as the case may be. Afterwards, the program will be implemented, no, and a donation will be made by the private entity. A corresponding deed of donation is also executed, and so is a deed of acceptance. Now, to avail yung tax incentives natin, yung private entity will submit its application to the Adopt a School Program Secretariat. Tapos after a series of endorsements, it will eventually be forwarded to the concerned Revenue District Office o RDO ng Bureau of Internal Revenue. So ano ba, what is the governing rule for availing the tax incentives provided by the Adopt a School Act? Next slide po tayo. We have Revenue Regulations number 10-2003 issued to last January 27, 2013. This revenue regulations implements the tax incentives provisions of the Adopt a School Act of 1998. Next slide po tayo. What are these tax incentives given to the adopting private entity? Number 1, deduction from the gross income of the amount of donation that were actually directly and exclusively incurred for the program. Number 2, additional amount of equivalent to 50% of the donation. So may additional tayo doon, deduction, no? Then the donation is also exempted from donor's tax. So let's go to the first one. Next slide. Under Section 34H2 of the Tax Code, donations are deductible in full for as long as these are made to the government to be used exclusively in undertaking priority activities in education, etc. No? So yan. Now, should donations given to the government not qualify under the foregoing criteria, donations will only be deductible to the extent of 10% of the donation. In case of individuals naman, 5% for corporations naman, no? So ganun, pag hindi siya pasok nun sa criteria natin, donations deductible lang up to 10% pag individuals and 5% for corporations. Next tayo. So in addition, no, private entities may avail of an additional deduction of 50% of the amount donated. So malaki-laki rin to. Next slide. Ano ba mga conditions natin? So the private entity may avail of these deductions. Next slide po tayo. The deduction should be availed of in the taxable year in which the expenses have been paid or incurred. Next slide. The taxpayer should be able to prove the deduction with sufficient evidence, like kanwari, official receipts or delivery receipts. So, and other adequate records. Kailangan mapatunayan, no, na yung pinaggastusan nga ng donation na gamit dun sa expenses for the school, no? So, what exactly are these that the private entity needs to show to prove to the BIR? Next slide po tayo. Una-una, kailangan mapakita natin yung amount ng expenses being claimed as deduction. Secondly, kailangan may direct connection or relation yung expenses dun sa adopting private entities participation sa Adopt a School program. Yung adopting private entity shall also provide a list of projects and or activities undertaken and the cost of each undertaking, indicating in particular where and how the assistance has been utilized as supported by the agreement. Tapos, we need also proof or acknowledgement of receipt. Okay? Proof or acknowledgement of receipt of the donated property by the recipient public school. Now, next slide. Lastly, the application, so consisting of all documentary requirements, no? Together with the approved agreement consisting of the MOA, the deed of donation, deed of acceptance also, shall be filed with the BIR Revenue District Office having jurisdiction over the place of business of the adopting private entity as endorsed by the Secretariat. Also, copy furnishing the RDO having jurisdiction over the property if the contribution or the donation is in the form of real property. Next slide. Lastly, no, under Section 101 of the Tax Code, no donor's tax will be due on the donation. So ano to? Donor's tax exempt to. Next slide po tayo. Okay, so let's talk about the other tax consequences surrounding donation. No? Next slide. In the case of foreign donations, the VAT and yung excise tax on the importation of the goods shall be assumed by the DepEd, SHED, or TESDA, as the case may be, being the consignee or the importer of the donation. But if it falls under any of the transactions enumerated under Section 109 of the Tax Code, it will be exempt. In the next slide. In case the local donation is considered as a transaction deemed sale of goods or properties originally intended for sale by the adopting private entity, the transfer shall be subject to VAT. But of course, if it is not considered as a transaction deemed sale, then it will be exempt from VAT, no? The next slide. So how do we determine yung valuation of the donation or contribution made? How do we determine its valuation? Take note that the donation can be in various forms, no? In such as infrastructure, teaching and skills development, learning support, computer, science labs, pwede rin food and nutrition. So maraming pwede, no? For cash contribution, particularly, it shall be based on the actual amount contributed, donated, appearing in the official receipt issued by the donee. So next slide. Ngayon, for non-monetary contributions, depende siya sa property. If the donation is in the form of a personal property, the amount of the contribution shall be based on its acquisition cost. But no, if the property had already been used, then the valuation shall take into consideration the depreciated value of the property. If the assistance is in the form of consumable goods, the amount of contribution or donation shall be based on the acquisition cost by the donor or the actual cost at the time of the donation, whichever is lower. Next slide po. So if in the form of services naman ng ating assistance dun sa public school, the amount of contribution or donation shall be based dun sa value ng services rendered as agreed upon by the donor, the service provider, and the public school as fixed in the memorandum of agreement. So importante nakalagay sa MOA yun kapag service yung ang donation natin sa school. Or the actual expenses incurred by the donor, whichever is lower. On the other hand, if the assistance is in the form of real property, the amount of the contribution shall be the zonal value of the property at the time of the donation, or the book value or depreciated value of the property, whichever is lower. Next slide. So, okay, if I am a private entity, no, participating in the program, and I just made this contribution to a public school, ano bang kailangan ko na handain, no, to avail yung ating tax incentives? Next slide. The BIR will need the following: duly notarized or approved agreement, or yung MOA, duly notarized deed of donation, official receipts or any documents showing the actual value of the contribution or the donation, certificate of title and tax declaration if the donation is in the form of real property, and other adequate records showing the direct connection or relation of the expenses being claimed as donation, a deduction or donation to the adopting private entity's participation in the program, as well as showing or proving receipt of the donated property. So kailangan masubmit to lahat sa ating secretariat. So if the donation is real property, no, such as a school site, for example, you include there the certified true copies of the certificate of title and the tax deck. Kapag personal property naman o goods like school bus or school supplies, you can submit pictures naman of the actual distribution of the project, of the product being distributed to the school or the students. Also include a summary of expenses, no, showing the date of that it was distributed, cost of the goods, the name of the suppliers, and the purchase invoice. So for services naman like trainings or seminars for teachers, you can submit photos of the services being rendered, and also yung summary of expenses showing the service provider, value of the service, the invoices, showing the payment to the service and providers, etc. So, yun lang naman, no? That would be all. So, thank you for listening to me, no, discuss the tax incentives provided by this app. We hope that the tax incentives continue to help encourage more private entities to participate in the program, since it will truly help the country in being able to provide quality education, especially to those who are least fortunate among us. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Attorney Ralbert John Neil Tibayan, for enlightening us about the RA 8525 or the Adopt a School Act of 1998. And sa ating pong mga viewers, you may now comment your questions, no? And at this moment, let us now invite our Attorney 3, the Law and Legislation Division of Bureau of Internal Revenue. We have also Attorney Brianna K. De Los Santos. Ayan. Good morning po, Attorney De Los Santos.
Good morning po, Sir Saridil.
Ayan. So maraming salamat po sa pagbigay po ng time sa amin para po mag-answer po ng mga questions mula po sa ating mga viewers for today. Ayan. So, wait po tayo ng questions, no? Mag-comment po sila ng questions. Ayan, Sir Ken. May mga tanong na ba tayo sa comment section natin?
Antayin natin ang ating PWG na mag-post ng mga questions. Once again po, good morning po sa ating dalawang sisipag na attorney po from BIR.
Good morning po, Sir Ken.
Attorney De Los Santos, baka po meron po kayong i-add sa sinabi po ni Attorney Tibayan kanina po.
I guess Attorney Ralbert has already discussed the tax incentives as implemented by Revenue Regulations 10/2003. So, magka-clarify na lang po kami ng mga any questions na itatanong po ng ating viewers po.
Okay, Sir Ken, meron ka bang katanungan dyan?
Ayan, i-post na natin ang ating mga katanungan dyan. Baka meron, ayan po ito. First question po sa husing na attorney. Pwede po bang maka-avail ng tax incentive SMEs or small and mid-sized enterprises? Yan po, first question.
So, on the question po kung makaka-avail ang SME, under the revenue regulation po, pag sinasabi nating private entity, sino ang makaka-avail, dinefine po siya namin as any individual. Kahit individual po, pwedeng mag-avail as long as it is engaged in trade or business or kahit po mga professionals. Kasi nakasabi rin dito, individuals engaged or trade or business or in the exercise of profession. So lahat po sila pwede po, so including MSMEs, pwede pong maka-avail po ng exemption.
Okay.
Yes, po.
Thank you po, Attorney.
Ayan, next question.
Ayan. Ang second question po natin, Attorney De Los Santos and Attorney Tibayan, paano po ang tax incentives naman kung ang private entity ay nakabase abroad?
Ayan, magandang tanong.
Talagang kahit yung mga Pilipino natin, kapwa Pilipino na nasa abroad, no, working abroad, pwede, di ba?
Gustong tumulong, ano?
Yes po, sir. There is no prohibition po on those private entities kahit po naka-base abroad. Kasi po, sinabi dito sa definition natin, any individual, partnership, corporation, or cooperative, either resident or non-resident. So, ang issue lang po natin, under sa Section 4 po ng tax exemption, is ano ang mangyayari. Di ba, clear na tayo, exempt po siya kung magkano yung contribute niya, actually, directly and exclusively. Tapos may 50% siya, tapos may exemption din po siya sa donor's tax. However, kung abroad po siya, may tendency po na magsasubject siya sa excise at VAT. May VAT po on the importation. So, anong mangyayari po kung may VAT on importation? Ang mangyayari po sa under the regulation natin, sino ang magbabayad ng VAT? Sa regulation po, si DepEd, CHED or TESDA ang magiging liable sa VAT. Kasi sila ang kino-consider as importer. But under the said regulation, it is also chargeable po sa GAA ng DepEd, TESDA or CHED. Yan po, sir.
Alright, thank you very much po, Attorney De Los Santos. Sir Ken, meron tayong phone-in question dito, no? From about yung third question natin.
Okay. So ito po from one of our ASDS po ito. In case na mag-avail po, who will prepare the document? Sorry. Magkano ang ceiling amount to avail tax incentive? Meron po bang ceiling amount po ito?
Under the regulations po, wala pong ceiling amount. As long as established po ng donor na ma-establish ng donor kung ano yung that amount expenses, may substantiation po. Ma-prove nyo, may mga resibo, ganun po. 100% of that donation is allowable deduction plus additional 50%. So wala po siyang
Sa with supporting documents, Attorney, no?
yes, substantiation requirement po tayo.
Apo. So Ken, meron din pong follow-up question din po from still ASDS Medina. In case po na mag-avail, who will prepare the documentation? Ayan.
Actually po sir, sa discussion ni Attorney Tibayan, nasabi po na 'di ba yan ang magre-reflect yan sa books ng mga corporations, individuals sa kanilang income tax return. So, since the Philippines is adopting a voluntary payment, so sila po ang mag-prepare. Kaya lang, may mga requirements po tayo according sa regulations kung ano ang gagawin ng mga individuals, corporations, basta na, lahat ng private entity na magdo-donate, ano ang gagawin nila. So, kanina na-discuss na po ni Attorney Tibayan na mag-submit po sila sa National Secretariat. At si National Secretariat ang mag-i-endorse po sa BIR. So, saan niya i-endorse ng National Secretariat? I-endorse po siya sa Revenue District Office kung saan registered. Si corporation, si individual. So, example, registered po siya sa Quezon City, pupunta po siya sa Quezon City. Kung sa Caloocan, sa Caloocan. So, yun po. However, if ang company, a corporation, the donor is from Quezon City, pero ang ano niya, ang property is Caloocan, dapat mag-submit siya ng application sa Quezon City, copy furnish ang RDO ng Caloocan where the property is located.
Alright.
po.
Thank you very much po, Attorney De Los Santos. And thank you very much po sa ating ASDS,
Yes,
Dr. Medina. Ayan. So, Sir Ken, meron tayong isa pang question. I think last na ito, no?
Opo, siguro. Basahin ko na po, Sir Sai. And ito po, ano po ang kadalasang ginagamit na basis ng schools and donors para po ma-determine ang value ng services rendered as donation or contribution?
Depende. Sabi ko niya.
Actually, na-discuss na rin po kanina, how do we value services? If kung magkano po ang pinag-usapan sa Memorandum of Agreement. So, kung paano siya binalue doon sa MOA as agreed by the donor, service provider, and the public school. Or if ever, how much po yung actual expenses incurred by the donor. So kasi di ba nangyayari, hindi naman necessarily si donor ang magpe-perform ng service. Di ba? It can contract with a third party to render service for the donee. So, kung mangyayari yan, kung magkano ang ginastos ni donor sa service na kinontract niya, yun po yung gagamitin nating valuation. Or, kung magkano sa MOA, but since this is a deduction, whichever is lower.
Okay po. Thank you po. Ayan, siguro follow-up question, Sir Ken, no?
Opo. Sabi po, pwede po for example po, 10,000 pesos ang donation, magkano ang ma-avail po na tax incentive?
Compute tayo.
So, ang ma-avail po is the full 10,000 pesos provided that you can substantiate it. You can establish the direct connection po sa donation na dapat na ano siya na pertain siya sa sa educational intention, and 'di ba may additional 50% po tayo. So bali 15,000.
15,000.
Ano?
Okay.
Plus also
Walang donor tax.
exempt siya sa donor's tax.
Yun. So
ang donor's tax natin po, sir, 6% rin po yun.
Okay.
Okay po, Attorney. So, I think that would be all, Sir Ken, no? Thank you very much po, Attorney Tibayan and Attorney De Los Santos, for answering all of the queries